Dragon Ball GT is a series that has proven divisive in the Dragon Ball community. To many, it's the worst product to come out of the franchise, aside from perhaps Dragon Ball Evolution or The Magic Begins. For others, it's a beloved and misunderstood series that has only grown better with time, particularly in the age of the Dragon Ball Renaissance. Upon rewatching it myself, I can certainly see the good and the bad. In my last video, I discussed 10 things I like about Dragon Ball GT, but in this video, I'm going to give the other side of the coin, and talk about the 10 things I don't like. So for those GT haters out there, make sure to grab a snack, a drink, and your closest Dragon Ball Super memorabilia, and let's get into this video. So the first thing I have to talk about on this list is the opening arc of the series, the hunt for the Black Star Balls. Now in my previous video I talked about how Toei tried to start things off by shifting things back to an earlier sense of adventure, something that has been missing from the franchise since the original Dragon Ball ended. However, when it came to the execution, they really messed up here, because it simply doesn't work. The first arc of Dragon Ball GT, and really everything up until Baby appeared, ended up being one of the most boring stretches of the entire franchise. It was poorly paced, tensionless, and the tone of it was all over the place. On one hand, we were told that Goku and friends only had a single year to find the balls, in the vastness of the galaxy. This put a ticking clock on their adventure, which is a storytelling device meant to create tension and a dark possible outcome. Yet Goku, Pan, and Trunks spent an exorbitant amount of time just screwing around, getting into wacky hijinks, with some of them being a blatant copy and paste from Dragon Ball. The Black Star Balls, which served as the means of getting our characters out into space, ended up being a big hindrance, because we can't just have fun when we know in the back of our minds that everyone's life is on the line. It's like if Link spent most of his time fishing in Majora's Mask when the moon is about to kill everyone in Termina. Except unlike Link, Goku can't just travel back in time at his own convenience. Another problem is the cast itself. On one hand, it's nice to see that Toei tried to focus on characters like Pan and present Trunks, but honestly, they're not a very entertaining or even likable cast at this point. Trunks has next to no personality, and Pan seems to have borrowed much of hers from Chi-Chi, complaining or chastising Goku for much of the time that she's on screen. We could have had so many more entertaining characters go along on the trip. Yet they went with the blandest lineup, while Oob and Goku's children are just left behind in a big bait-and-switch moment. Also, Goku himself is a problem, mainly because we already know how strong he is from the last series. He's way too overpowered compared to everyone he meets, so it makes every encounter with villains and obstacles totally tensionless. Ironically, the show only starts to get good when we go back to the Earth and focus on the previous cast. So this was a failure of execution. And speaking of a failure of execution, we go back to Goku, and more specifically the next thing on this list, with him being transformed into a kid. Now I understand why Toei did this. They wanted to use it to stand apart from Z, go back to an earlier sense of adventure, and tonally change things. But despite that, this was a mistake. One of the big appeals of Dragon Ball was seeing our characters grow. We start the series off with a child with incredible strength who grew up before our very eyes, becoming a teenager and then an adult, a father and a grandfather. Taking all of that and then turning him back into a kid feels like a regression, especially because Goku doesn't suddenly become a different character when he changes. He's still the same man he was before, and with the same level of power, just in a smaller body. We're not suddenly going to forget that. Now, Toei could have used this idea better. They could have significantly nerfed Goku, saying he lost most of his power when he transformed. This would have increased the stakes and made any danger that Goku enters into more significant, because weaker enemies could realistically stand a chance. The only things that actually affected were minor, such as Goku not being able to use instant transmission or hold Super Saiyan 3. But he never really needs those things anyway. And so this only serves as a minor inconvenience. It also leads into the next thing on this list, power scaling. Now you guys have heard me talk about power scaling in Dragon Ball a lot over the years, and when it comes to Dragon Ball GT, it makes the worst power scaling in Z look downright competent. After his training with Oob for roughly 5 years, Goku is more powerful in his base form alone than pretty much everyone else in the series. Goku is made so overpowered in this show for no other reason than the fact that he's the main character. Even Oob, who is presented as being this ultimate prodigy with the potential of Kid Buu, pales in comparison to Goku's power. And the fact that the story centers around Goku doesn't help the tension because he could solo most of the characters in his base form alone. But that's only Goku. Then there's Pan, who at this point is a 9-year-old girl who hasn't gone through anywhere near the training that Goku and the others around her have. Yet without even being a Super Saiyan, she's capable of decking General Rildo, a character who was said to be stronger than Majin Buu. She was also able to fight Dr. Gero and did more ridiculous feats. She doesn't even have her own built-in rage-induced plot power like Gohan. She's just strong, because reasons. And then there's the fact that Toei seems to have forgotten how Super Saiyan works, since Goku and Trunks, who have been Super Saiyans for decades, are constantly placed into situations where they can just transform and instantly win in fights. Yet they only do it during dramatic moments where the tension would seemingly be ripe. It's all artificial tension that doesn't work at all and makes fights boring and frustrating to watch. It's obvious to me that Toei didn't even try to have this make sense in the show, either because they didn't care or didn't have the ability to do so. On the subject of things that make no sense, there are a lot of plot holes and inconsistencies in this show. Like the aforementioned fact that characters don't transform or solve problems instantly, which usually results in me yelling, "Just go Super Saiyan!" at my TV over and over again. Then there's also a lot of events surrounding Baby and his arc. Like for instance, after Baby is released from his pod, when he was seemingly destroyed, Baby survives and is revealed to have a piece of himself inside of Dr. Mew, controlling him and having him create Baby. But this doesn't really make a lot of sense when you put everything under a scope. The same could be said for when we find out that Baby has a piece of himself inside of General Rildo, and somehow Goku is able to kill Rildo with a Kamehameha, despite them literally establishing in the last fight that Rildo's body is like an avatar, and his true form is all of the metal on planet M2, which obviously Baby couldn't have taken over. Then there's a bunch of inconsistencies in the Super 17 arc, especially regarding the androids, with the biggest one being how Dr. Gero and Dr. Mew could somehow build an android in hell. Like, where did they even get the materials for that? And there's just a lot of other stuff in the series that makes absolutely no sense. Which leads into the next thing, that it wasn't based on source material by Akira Toriyama. Now, this is a major reason why most fans don't consider the series canon, even though technically it still fits in with the Z anime. Toei Animation created this series without much input from Toriyama in order to capitalize on the popularity of Z. But aside from the canon implications, this led to a lot more problems. As with Dragon Ball and Z, they had a strong foundation to build off of with the Dragon Ball manga, which served as the structure for the show. They weren't required to alter or improvise much, except for during the times when they had to create filler in order to not pass the ongoing manga. But with GT, all of this was out the window. The show writers were left to create everything on their own, only with the pre-existing world and the series as their guide. It's very similar to Dragon Ball Super in that sense, except with Super, Toriyama has given them some notes and bullet points of information, and they fill in the blanks. But with GT, it was nothing but a blank canvas. Now, making a story up as you go along on a weekly basis can be very difficult, but whereas Toriyama was able to excel at it, Toei had never been that great at doing so. I think that if Toriyama had been more involved in the story and other aspects, it would have been a lot better, or at least felt more in line with his original work. But by this point, he had moved on. Toei, on the other hand, wasn't so willing. But I'll get more into that later. Going back to the villains of the story, fans usually have fond memories regarding Baby, the Para brothers, and some of the Shadow Dragons. But aside from a few of these standouts, most of the villains in GT kind of suck, like most of the villains from the first arc, such as Cardinal Muchi Muchi and God of Destruction Lude. And let's not forget the worst villain in the entire franchise, Daltaki. And the less said about him, the better. Hellfighter 17 was kind of interesting, and so was the idea of 17 turning evil, and the mad scientists of Dragon Ball Z and GT teaming up. But Super 17 himself sucks. His design is poor, looking like a lamer, bulkier Cro-Magnon 17 with no eyebrows, and on top of that, his execution is severely lacking. Most of the Shadow Dragons are pretty bad too. People generally remember the concept and how cool it was, but forget the execution. All of the dragons up to Nova, Ice, and and Sin are lame, and the arc before them is also pretty bad. All the while, the other characters just sit around doing nothing instead of helping Goku and Pan when their entire world is hanging in the balance. On that topic, the next thing on this list is the character utilization. Most of the characters in the show are completely useless, and the legacy characters are barely featured at all. Most of the human characters like Roshi, Yamcha, and Tien are reduced to cameos, while others get an even worse rap, like Krillin, who shows up just to get killed by Android 17. Then there's Piccolo, who isn't even used for most of the series, despite him being central in the creation of the Black Star Balls, but much like Krillin, he shows up briefly, only to have him sacrifice his life out of nowhere. It's all a ploy to emotionally manipulate the audience without actually earning any of that emotion. The writers drudged up older characters we care about, and then have them being threatened or killed off because they can't create a compelling emotional narrative on their own. Even the characters who started out being important, like Trunks and Pan, only amount to people who can recharge Goku's energy, or buy him time so that he can save the day. Because as so many people have pointed out over the decades, GT doesn't stand for Grand Tour, but rather Goku time. And that's also the next thing on this list. Now, there was an interview years back with GT producer Kozo Morishita, where he was asked about how the series was planned out. And I think this particular response he gave is very telling about all of this. What he says is, when all is said and done, the protagonist of Dragon Ball is Son Goku. Characters such as Piccolo, Vegeta, or Trunks may be popular too, but in the end, it's Goku. As their creator, I felt that in my bones, and Dragon Ball GT's biggest sticking point was how to intertwine Goku into the story of Pan, and the rest of the next generation of kids. That's when I thought of turning Goku back into a kid himself. So essentially, this resulted in the problem known as Goku time, where no matter what happens in GT, Goku is the be-all, end-all, and is presented as such. And much like Goku turning back into a kid, this was another major mistake, and one so central to the issues of the series. When we take a look at Goku's story in Dragon Ball, it had gone everywhere it needed to by the end of Dragon Ball Z. By the Cell Saga, his character was played out. He was a legendary Super Saiyan who had pushed his power to his limits, and eventually sacrificed his life, handing the torch off to his son to be the main character. In the Buu Saga, he was abruptly brought back, but even this was supposed to be one last hurrah. This was acknowledged when he took on Oob as his apprentice, and flew away with him at the end of the story. Goku had left this part of his character behind. It was time for the next generation to take over. Yet in GT, they once again regressed this. The show once again revolved around Goku, and to such a degree that nearly everyone else felt worthless. Even Goku's apprentice Oob is thrown to the background and totally wasted. By doing this, they regressed Goku far more than turning him into a kid ever did. And ultimately, they did it at the cost of the next generation, minimizing them so much that there was nothing left for them to do. They were totally wasted, and if the show had instead been centered around characters with more room to grow, and with Goku going into the background and taking on the Master Roshi type role, GT would have likely been far better and not came to such a rushed conclusion. And on that subject, the series actually was kind of rushed into development from the very beginning. And that's because of the next thing on this list, which is that Dragon Ball GT, in and of itself, was basically a cash grab on the part of Toei Animation. With the Dragon Ball manga having come to an end and the Z series following soon after, Toei didn't want their most popular and successful series to come to an end. They were making far too much money for that. As a result, they scrambled to come up with an idea for a follow-up, without Toriyama, that they can do in a way where they can indefinitely stretch it out. That was the reason why they set the first arc in space, because it was meant to stay there a lot longer. But due to the critical response and a sharp decline in ratings, this wouldn't last long. Ultimately, the main driving motivator for this series wasn't out of an artistic place of inspiration. It wasn't created to tell a story that needed to be told, or out of a passion for the world and the characters. The true motivation was to make money, and as we know from so many other franchises, corporate greed doesn't usually lead to great art. Maybe if Toei had waited longer to make the show, giving it at least a few years or more, and spent more time planning it out, things could have been better. Maybe by that point, Toriyama would have wanted to return, even in a limited capacity. They could have even done it around the time that they originally did Battle of Gods, when Toriyama was incentivized by the dumpster fire that was Dragon Ball Evolution. Because it had been so long, fans were more accepting of a new Dragon Ball, and willing to overlook many of its flaws. The same could have been the case for GT. But instead, it ended up being the final thing on this list, which is wasted potential. Dragon Ball GT was a follow-up to one of the greatest and most influential anime and manga franchises of all time. It had such high standards to live up to, and they could have done so much more with the story set after the end of Z. But what we ended up getting was a 64-episode series and a single TV special. What they did in the series is so much less than they could have. Arcs could have been longer, more intense, involving more characters, and more emotion. We could have seen the rise of a whole new generation of warriors who would lead the franchise into the future, yet what we did get was often underwhelming or totally wasted. Baby was a good villain, but everything after it was rushed and weak by comparison. The Super 17 arc was so short that it fits on a single DVD, something I never even realized until my most recent rewatch. And although the end of the Shadow Dragon arc was a high point, what came before wasn't much to remember. If Dragon Ball GT had lived up to its full potential, it would have been far more successful and had a longer legacy. But unfortunately, the entire series ended up being another example of wasted potential. So these have been 10 things I don't like about Dragon Ball GT. Now, despite all of these criticisms, I still think the series is worth watching for Dragon Ball fans, because there's a lot to like about it, which I discussed in this video here. At the end of the day, you should ultimately make up your own mind about the series, and not just go along with the common perception. Go ahead and see for yourself. You may be surprised by what you find. Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. If you like this content, you can help support LSM on Patreon, a link to which is down below in the description. Make sure to subscribe and enable all notifications, so you can stay up to date with all of my videos. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.